Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Chris DeFay. I am a member of the Talks at Google team here at Google Los Angeles. And we're very pleased to have everyone here in the audience. And if you're watching on YouTube, welcome also. I'm pleased to introduce Peter Zuckerman today. He's a journalist and nonfiction writer who joins us to talk about his book, Buried in the Sky. He's written an incredibly engaging book about one of the most dramatic disasters in alpine history, 2008 climb of K2. Zuckerman interviewed the Sherpa survivors and others to capture what happened and to tell this amazing story from a fresh perspective. Please join me in welcoming Peter Zuckerman.
Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks for having me. I bet you there are not many books that in the acknowledgments actually thank Google Documents. This entire book was written on Google Docs. I have a collaborator, co-author, who lives in Spain. And this book sincerely would have been impossible without Google Documents. So thank you if you're one of the people who helped create that. This project, it started 3 years ago. I had a comfortable job at the Oregonian, which is the largest newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. And I got a call from my cousin, and she was really upset. She called me and she told me her really good friend had just died in this mountaineering disaster. And she said, Peter, we have to find out what happened, and I've got this great idea. You'll fly to Pakistan, you'll fly to Nepal, we'll write a book, and everything will be terrific, and we'll have this great success. And I said, no, that sounds like a terrible idea. I'm not a mountaineer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be trekking around villages that are technically off limits to journalists in Nepal. I also wasn't sure it was safe to be a gay Jewish American trekking through regions of northern Pakistan that have been infested by terrorists, or Taliban at least, and that the US Embassy had warned me in a very long letter to stay away from. We didn't have a publisher, and I'd have to quit my job, and I'd have to interview people who I honestly had no idea if anybody would be interested in talking to them. This book just sounded like a terrible idea. So I said, no, I'm not going to do this book. But I agreed to look into the story. And I've always loved adventure stories. And the 2008 disaster on K2 is a mountain between China and Pakistan. It was one of the most dramatic. It was life and death at the limits of human endurance. It's triumph and tragedy on a peak that's so lethal, most mountaineers consider it suicide. And I'm researching this, and I'm seeing photos, and you see the photos in the book, of people right before they died, or right before they made big decisions that led to people living or dying. And I felt like you saw people at their most elemental level. The characters were larger than life. They were the kind of people you do not bump into every day. It takes a unique kind of personality to climb up what many people consider the world's most dangerous mountain. And the characters were often very difficult people. And they're trapped inside the same tents, and they clash with each other when their lives depend on them getting together, or getting along together. And you think you know who they are, and then right when things get really bad, they turn out to be somebody else. And there are characters that put me in their shoes, and I thought they would put readers in their shoes, that they make you ask yourself what you would do under similar circumstances. I mean, are you the kind of person who, when things get bad, do you go out there and rescue people? Do you hang back? Would you rescue somebody if they were from a different country and they spoke a different language and didn't have a lot of money? I mean, it makes you ask yourself what kind of person you are. And so I thought, okay, it's a compelling story with characters that really draw me in. But I just felt like it still wasn't enough to do a book, that there are plenty of adventure stories about people trying to make it up a mountain. And what really appealed to me and what really got me to do this book is that it illustrates a much more universal problem, a problem that we face nearly every day all the time. Let me explain what I mean by that. Among mountaineers, they're the Sherpas. The Sherpas hold this nearly mythical status. They have this seemingly superhuman ability to do some of the most dangerous and difficult climbing. On a commercial expedition, they scout the routes, they break the trail, they fix the ropes, they establish the camps, they make the food, they take their climbers to the summit, they snap the photo that runs in all the newspapers of the person on the summit, they rescue their client when they fall and slip, and this is their job. It's to safely get their clients up and down a mountain. They're often more celebrated clients. And their stories are rarely told, and in some of the most famous adventure stories of all time, their names aren't even included, or it's just one line and you don't really know who they are. And they're the unsung heroes of some of the most famous adventure stories. And that got me thinking that we usually tell history through the eyes of the kings and the Columbuses, not from the perspective of the help. And mountaineering shows how this kind of omission can lead to a disaster. That when your life hangs from a knot, you need to know who tied it. You need to know if it was tied correctly. When you're putting together a team of people to lead you up a mountain, you need to know very basic things about those people, like whether they speak the same language and whether they are business and ethnic rivals who will work together and want to work together and can work together. And when you tell an incomplete story, when you tell a story that omits crucial perspectives, what you fail to learn can lead to a disaster. And worse yet, you might not even find out what really happened, what the consequences of your actions were. And people will keep repeating your errors. And these were major issues on K2 in 2008. So for the rest of us, for those of us who aren't K2 mountaineers, I feel like we're largely in the same situation, that we all hang from knots that other people have tied, that we all have mountains to summit, and that we're all surrounded by people we rarely notice. You think the person who prepares your food at a restaurant or at the cafeteria, I don't know, and the last mechanic to check the plane before takeoff, or the nurse who sterilizes the syringe before an injection. This book dramatizes the fact that there are Sherpas, that there are people we often overlook all around us, and we cannot afford to ignore them, that the Sherpas of every story need to be seen for whom they really are because our lives depend on them. That, to me, seemed like a good reason to write a book. And that's how I decided to do it. And so I quit my job, and it was a nice job, and I dove into it, and I flew off first to Nepal. And I quickly learned that doing journalism in South Asia is not at all like doing it in the United States, and I'll give you some examples of that. When I arrived in Kathmandu, I learned that almost every Sherpa has one of 7 names. It's the day of the week they were born, male or female. So everybody born on Monday is named Dawa. And everybody born on Tuesday is Mingma. And everybody born on Wednesday is Lakpa, all the way up to Sunday, which is Nima. And there's some variations to that, but they're not that many. And for a last name, almost all the Sherpas use the name Sherpa. So you'd think the system kind of works in a really small village where everybody knows each other. And you can say, Monday, the daughter of Monday. But in a city, honestly, it's just dysfunctional. Phone books don't help. Gossipers have to provide these elaborate descriptions of the people they're maligning. the nicknames abound, but names have power, and you're not going to tell an outsider your nickname. I mean, you're probably not going to tell many people at all. And so tracking down the right person, just figuring out which Pasang Sherpa out of the 20,000 Pasang Sherpas who live in the same neighborhood, which one is the one you're looking for, really was a challenge. And then there were the villages. To do this research, I had to go to villages that, getting there, I think people have been places that, don't have phones or electricity or running water or antibiotics or petroleum. But getting to a lot of the villages, there were no roads, there was no metal, there was very little, or I don't know if there was any machinery, and it could take weeks to get there. You would go from the nearest airstrip, you would just start backpacking. And at each village, the languages were, by some anthropologists, consider each language at each village a separate language. And so you would have to find a translator who could speak the language there and a common language with the team of translators I was with to try to translate to English so I could understand what was happening. And just to be honest, sit-down interviews really didn't work that well. I would ask questions like, how old are you? And it would go through two translators. How old are you? How old are you? And there would be a little discussion between two of the people, and then between the two translators, and then finally I would get an answer that was like, I was born during the Buddha's, corn festival. And I'd say, oh, what year was that? And and it really made, I realized that the questions I asked just didn't always make sense. And so to do the research, I realized at least for the significant interviews, this was going to take a long time, but getting places was also going to take a long time. So I just did the interviews by trekking with the people I was interviewing. So while we were en route from one village to the next, we would just go as a big group, and I would just interview people all day, every day, for weeks at a time. And and with the main characters, a lot longer than that. And that was how we were finally able to get the story. And so my point of telling you all this is that I don't think there's a conspiracy to hide the story of the Sherpas. I think it's just a really challenging story for reporters on a deadline to be able to get. We say in the book that we researched for 2 years and that we took 7 trips to Nepal, but then we ended up taking 9 trips to Nepal because we had to go back and we wanted to fact check everything to make sure we got it right. We also took 3 trips to Pakistan, which is where K2 is, and I'll talk about the Pakistani climbers as well here. And we got unprecedented access to military and government officials. Nazir Sabir, who was a politician and a president of the Alpine Club, went all out to get us incredible access. In total, we interviewed more than 200 people at length, and we also spent countless hours at kitchen tables in France, Holland, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Serbia, Spain, Switzerland, and the United States. And we relied on more than 1,000 photographs and videos. This is from Pakistan, and we're going across a bridge. At first, these bridges look really scary, but you get used to them, actually, after a while. But it gives you an idea of what some of the area looked like. So, okay, you're probably wondering now, what is this book about? And I'm going to jump right into it. It's about a mountaineering disaster. And the disaster lasted 27 hours. And I'm going to read us an excerpt that's from a scene that occurs a little bit less than halfway through. Hanging off the face of a cliff, an ice axe the only thing between him and death, a Sherpa climber named Chhiring Dorje swung to the left. A massive ice boulder ripped off above, hurtling toward him. It was the size of a refrigerator. The underbelly caught, and the mass flipped, cartwheeling down. It tore past, skimming Chhiring's shoulder, then vanished. Broof! It slammed into something below, shattering. The mountain shook with the impact. Powder shot up in a column. It was near midnight on August 1st, 2008, and Chhiring had only a hazy idea of where he was, on or near the bottleneck of K2, the deadliest stretch of the most dangerous mountain. At roughly the cruising altitude of a Boeing 737, the bottleneck stretched away from Chhiring into the darkness below. In the starlight, the channel seemed bottomless, as wisps of fog slithered into the abyss. Above, a lip of ice curled like the barrel of a crashing wave. Oxygen depletion had turned Chhiring's mind to mush. Hunger and exhaustion had broken his body. When he opened his mouth, his tongue froze. When he gasped for breath, the moistureless air scoured his throat and lashed his eyes. Chhiring felt robotic, cold, too tired to think of what he'd sacrificed to get to K2. The Sherpa mountaineer, who had summited Everest 10 times, had been consumed by K2 for decades. A far more difficult peak than Everest's, K2 summit is one of the most prestigious prizes in mountaineering. Chhiring had gone despite his wife's tears, despite the climb costing more money than his father had made in 40 years, despite his Buddhist Lama warning him that K2's goddess would never tolerate the climb. Chhiring had made it to the summit of K2 that evening without using bottled oxygen, vaulting him into an elite group of the most successful mountaineers, but descent wasn't turning out as planned. He had dreamed of the achievement, a heroic reception, even fame. None of that mattered now. Chhiring had a wife, 2 daughters, a thriving business, and a dozen relatives who depended on him. All he wanted to do was get home, alive. So Chhiring, he's on the bottleneck of K2. That's an excerpt from the prologue. And he can't afford to slip because it turns out that the fixed ropes, the ropes that he was relying on to get down, they've been torn out by a chunk of falling ice. Nobody saw that. It was too dark to see it. It might have been the size of this building. It might have been the size of a bus. But it had been shredded, and he's going down the bottleneck of K2 with this wall of ice, and he encounters another climber who others have passed. This climber, Pasang Lama, has lost his axe, his ice axe, which is a crucial piece of equipment. It's really basically impossible to climb down a wall of ice with no rope and no ice axe. And so Pasang is stranded. He's actually from a different ethnic group who the Sherpas also often consider rivals. He's on a different team, and he's preparing to die. And Chhiring decides to do what in some ways just seems it's both heroic and kind of insane. He takes out a piece of rope from his pack, maybe an arm length or 2 across, and he ties it onto Pasang, and they start going down the deadliest stretch of the most dangerous mountain with Pasang literally hanging off Chhiring. So that's where I'm going to pick up the excerpt. Rocks and chunks of ice spun at them, dinging their helmets, but they were halfway down and thought they'd survive. The night was windless, -4 degrees Fahrenheit, almost warm for K2. The lights of high camp were smoldering below. Chhiring and Pasang didn't expect it to happen. A chunk of ice or rock knocked Pasang on the head. Batted off the ice, he swung like a piñata. The force of Pasang's body on the rope peeled Chhiring from the slope. The men tore downward. Chhiring gripped his axe with both hands and slammed it into the mountain. The blade wouldn't catch. It cut surgically through the snow. Sliding faster, Chhiring heaved his chest against the adze of his axe, digging into the slope. No good. Chhiring fell faster, another 7 yards, another 10. Pasang punched the slope with his fists and tried to grip, but his fingers skated along the ice. Chhiring and Pasang, as they fell into the darkness, must have wondered, how did this happen? Part of what attracted me to this story was that initial question, how did this happen? But to dig deeper, I had to get answers to tougher questions, and I'm going to read an excerpt that gives you a sense of what I mean by that. Many of the alpinists considered themselves to be among the best in the world. Some had risked everything to scale K2. their climb had devolved into a catastrophe. The final toll was bleak. Within 27 hours, 11 climbers had died in the deadliest single disaster in K2 history. What had gone wrong? Why had the climbers continued up when they knew they'd never make it down before nightfall? How had they made so many simple mistakes, such as failing to bring enough rope? The story became an international media sensation, landing on the covers of the New York Times, National Geographic Adventure, Outside, and in more than 1,000 other publications. It ricocheted around the blogosphere and inspired speculation, documentaries, a stage play revival, memoirs, and talk shows. Some considered the climb an example of hubris, a waste of life fueled by machismo or madness, thrill seekers trying too hard to get noticed by corporate sponsorship, lunatics climbing in a final act of escape, oblivious Westerners exploiting the lives of impoverished Nepalis and Pakistanis in a bid for glory. "You want to risk your life?" a response to one of the New York Times stories said. "Then do it in service of your country or family or neighborhood. Climbing K2 or Everest is a selfish stunt that benefits nothing." Others saw courage. Explorers pitted against the adversity of nature, lost souls embracing risk to find meaning in an empty world. "Climbing can expand the view of human potential for all of us," read a letter from Phil Powers, executive director of the Alpine Club, the American Alpine Club. Several people raised basic questions. What do men and women do when they're on top of a mountain dying? And why are some people driven to take such risks? Before they were trapped on the mountaintop, before the deaths and funerals, before the rescues and reunions, before the fistfights and friendships, before the recriminations and reconciliations, everything had seemed perfect. The equipment was checked and rechecked, the routes established, the weather cooperative, the teams intact. The moment they had spent so much time and training and money to reach, summit day had finally come. They were going to conquer K2, stand on top of the most vicious mountain on earth, howl in triumph, unfurl their flags, and call their sweethearts. I want to give you an idea of what K2 is. It's the second tallest mountain, and here's where it's located. It's between China and Pakistan. This is what it looks like. It has a much slimmer profile than Everest and is much steeper. This is what it looks like from the bottleneck near below or slightly below it. If you can imagine, this photo is actually looking up. So that ice there hangs over the climbers like a balcony. And the glacier on the mountain is pushing off chunks every once in a while, especially when the ice is refreezing at night. This is the view from the summit of the Karakoram range. It hooks into the Himalaya. It's a younger range, so it hasn't been chiseled down as much by the elements. It's much sharper. K2 lacks the mass of Everest, but it's sleeker and meaner. Climbers call it the Savage Mountain. Its peak has all the obstacles of Everest and more. K2's glaciers are riddled with fissures concealed by layers of snow. Climbers step on these crevasses, punch through, and, if unroped, disappear. Blocks of ice cleave off overhanging glaciers, avalanches roar down icy flanks, and then there's the altitude. No human, plant, or animal can tolerate such harsh conditions for more than a few days. With each lungful of air, climbers on the summit suck in only a third of the oxygen they breathe at sea level. Oxygen deprivation saps their strength and compromises their judgment. Altitude illness breaks them, giving some the coordination of toddlers. As if these difficulties weren't enough, storms are harsher on K2. It stands 882 miles northwest of Everest, and being further from the equator, is more vulnerable to unpredictable extratropical cyclones and their accompanying jet streams. All this makes for dismal statistics. Before 2008, only 278 people had stood on K2's summit. Everest's summit roll was 4,115, and its fatality rate, the percentage of climbers who went above base camp and died, had averaged 0.7% for the previous decade. Although the Himalayan database crunches these numbers for Everest, no accurate statistics exist for K2. Climbers of the Savage Mountain can't reliably approximate their chances of survival and don't want to. In 2008, the fatality rate of those leaving base camp for a summit bid was 30.5%, higher than the casualty rate at Omaha Beach on D-Day. Among high-altitude climbers, if not statisticians, there's no comparison. K2 is more lethal than Everest. Here's a photo of the two main characters. Last I was reading about them, they were hanging off the bottleneck, off an ice axe, and the bottleneck sliding down. Chhiring is the one who had the ice axe, and Pasang is the one who was hanging off of him. Chhiring is on your right and my left. I actually got to bring this book to Kathmandu and got to let them see it before it came out. So this is them seeing the book for the first time. I want to give you a little flavor of who the characters are. So I'm going to read an excerpt that characterizes Chhiring. He's the one on your right. His walk was more of a jog. He didn't drive a car. He rocketed through traffic on a black Honda Hero motorcycle. In the 7 languages he spoke conversationally, Chhiring Dorje Sherpa talked so quickly it seemed as though each sentence were one long word punctuated by exclamation points. Everything about him was accelerated. His eating, his thinking, his climbing, his praying. He couldn't control the pace. Speed was hardwired into his DNA. His first name meant long life, but its pronunciation to English speakers, Chhiring, personified him. Cheerful determination radiated from Chhiring. It got him noticed. Clients praised his, "You can do it, let's rock and roll, give me your pack," attitude. It was contagious. How could you sit still at camp when every few minutes he would lurch up, stride forward, chop his arms through the air, make a pronouncement, plop down, and spring up again? There was a reason this 34-year-old dynamo rarely drank coffee. He was caffeinated enough. Chhiring was always crazy, said his father, Noang Thundu Sherpa. He was a naughty child, and I knew he'd be a naughty adult. Here's Chhiring on the summit of K2. Then the other major character is Pasang, who is on your left. And this will be the last excerpt I'll read, but it gives you an idea of who he is. A sticker on his helmet labeled him the Joker, and Pasang lived up to it. He smuggled rocks into friends' sleeping bags, pillows, and packs. He wrapped pebbles in Tootsie Roll wrappers and handed them to children begging for candy. At night, he festooned tents with branch and trash towers. When the tent's occupants crawled out in the morning and the scaffolds crashed down, Pasang threw back his head, cackling, and galloped off in search of his next victim. When in the city, he was someone different. He cloaked his happy-go-lucky personality in an armor of shyness and caution. Men like Chhiring bounded up to newcomers with the enthusiasm of a Labrador, no matter the setting. In Kathmandu, Pasang couldn't do that. He hung back, keeping a safe distance. When acquaintances opened their arms for a hug, they received a handshake. While eating dinner with a group of new clients in Kathmandu, Pasang's body was at the table, but his eyes were patrolling the room, ready to alert him of danger. It often took him several hours to crack a smile for a stranger, but when he allowed one, his grin was sincere. Compact, stretching just shy of 5'2", Pasang had hands as rough as a cat's tongue. When he was 24 years old, he looked 15 and accepted his nickname, Little Pasang. Clients occasionally doubted that he was an adult and asked for, quote, another Sherpa with more experience than this baby. To age himself, Pasang rarely shaved, but it made no difference. His chin refused to grow a beard. Throughout writing this book, I felt a tremendous responsibility and respect for the characters. Many of them lost their lives or saw other people lose their lives, or had family members lost their lives, and they had to do really tough interviews with me, and in a way, this story is a really horrifying story. But in a way, it's also a really inspiring story. You see people who started off in small villages and become some of the best athletes in the world. Often athletes no one has heard of, but among the best. And they pull off some feats that just seem unimaginable. And so I want to say I'm grateful to my friends who have helped me see the top of the world through their eyes, because without their willingness, this book would have been impossible. And my hope is that when you read this book, that Amanda and I have made a small contribution to the way we tell stories, and that this story gives you a glimpse into yourself and helps you recognize and more deeply appreciate the Sherpas who are in your life. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
I guess I'll start with a question about your decision to write the book. Were you at all intimidated by Into Thin Air?
It's one of those weird things of publishing is, on the one hand, there's a book that's been extremely popular, so that shows that, hey, there might be room for another book. On the other hand, you're like, wow, I'm always going to, like that's what roughly established the genre. And I think Into Thin Air is a good book. I enjoyed it. I feel like this is sort of the corollary, where Into Thin Air is a first-person story told from Jon Krakauer's perspective. And this is, a more, I don't want to say more complete, but a more reporter's account told through the eyes of the Sherpas who do a lot of who fix the ropes that people like Jon Krakauer were going up. So, but yeah, it's a good book, and it's a little bit intimidating, yeah.
So I think we can all agree that the primary responsibility for making the poor decisions up on the mountain belong to the people that made the decisions. How much responsibility do you think the Sherpas should share for enabling people who may not be fully prepared or capable of making the climb to attempt something that they maybe shouldn't be doing?
There's some fundamental conflicts. The Sherpas get paid in part based on how many people make it to the summit. You get a summit bonus. So there's a clear incentive, especially when your family's relying on your income from that climb for the rest of the year, or for much of the rest of the year. There's a definite incentive to get your clients to the summit so you get that bonus. And Sherpas will say, oh, I'm not going to take someone up there who's going to die, but certainly I keep that in mind when I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm going to tell somebody to turn around. So that's just, in my opinion, I think a better system would be, you pay the Sherpas based on how many people make it back alive or something like that. I don't know if that model has been explored. And a lot of the decisions just weren't really decisions, they were just miscommunication. The client climbers, one of the problems in this disaster is there was one person who sort of could translate from the high altitude workers to the clients, and he got trapped down on a lower camp. And so, in a sense, a big part of the problem was there was just not much, there weren't decisions being made in a strategic way. It was just sort of lack of communication. And then you want to say, well, then why didn't they just turn around? And it's hard when you've been, when you've spent so much time and so many years waiting for this, and it's your third attempt at K2, but the other 2 seasons you came, the weather just never opened up, so there was no chance to even go for the summit, and this is your one last chance to go. It's really hard. I'm not saying it's the wrong decision to turn around, but it's a really hard decision to turn around. So I don't think that there's an easy, that the blame can be spread out among the whole, on individual decisions, on cultural lack of understanding on a whole systemic problems. There's no limit to the number of people who can climb up all at once, and so overcrowding is a big contributor. And do you blame Pakistan for that? I don't know. Or do you blame the climbers who all want to go up and are lobbying to let as many people go up at once? Or do you say that's a fine system because that's the most fair system? So I don't think there's a clear answer to that.
How are the professional climbers that you spoke to, the Sherpas who do this, how are they viewed within their own community?
How are the...
Within the Sherpa community, how are they seen? I mean, are they seen as irresponsible or as heroes or as,
There's a range. Some climbers have a terrible reputation and nobody wants to work for them. And in this book, there's a Korean team, and Mr. Kim has a really bad reputation among the Sherpas, and nobody wants to work for him. And so, frankly, the people who work for him are the ones who really desperately need to work. Really, their families are really relying on them, and they don't have that many other options. And he, has, for libel reasons, I don't think there's some things that I can't necessarily say that he's done, but I would say that he had a reputation for fighting with the Sherpas and forcing them to do things that they thought were a suicide mission. Then there are other climbers who really know the Sherpas, who speak their language and have really been advocates for them, and that have a great reputation among the Sherpas. And then there's a current movement which a lot of the Sherpas don't like, where the Western climbers are saying, we're going to do this ourselves without Sherpa support. And in a way, that's a more impressive way to climb a mountain, but it's something that the Sherpas don't necessarily like because they lose business. And so there can be resentment from the Sherpas, and the Sherpas aren't always nice either. I mean, I would say that it really, the reputations depend on the individuals very much, and that there's a huge range.
Kind of an interesting question to me is, among the Sherpa population in general, I mean, not every Sherpa villager does this for a living, right? I'm assuming it's a small minority who actually do this. It's a hard and dangerous job. How are the Sherpa who do this, how are they viewed within the larger Sherpa community?
The view, I would say the view is shifting. During the very early climbs in the late 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s, the mountains, the gods lived in the mountains, and climbing a mountain was a sin, and what you were doing was going to not just harm you, it was going to harm your whole family. And a lot of people who went climbing were really looked down on. But there's been sort of this shifting view where, especially on Mount Everest, well, Mount Everest's goddess, she has a gold face, she flies around on, I forget the type, is it a zebra? I forget, but she's the goddess of prosperity, and maybe she makes an exception, because lots of people are making it up Everest without getting hurt, lots of people are getting rich, so maybe it's okay to climb Everest if you make a lot of money. And so there's been sort of this growing acceptance of climbing is maybe it's a really good profession, because look, you talk to old Sherpas and they'll say, well, I used to think it was really terrible, but now my son comes home and look, I got new shoes and I have a roof over my, a nice tin roof over my house here, and so now I'm thinking mountaineering's a good thing. So I would say that there is a shift and in the culture happening as we speak, and it's becoming more and more acceptable. And among the youngest people, my observations were that they typically thought mountaineering was fine. I mean, that's a good way to make a living, albeit a dangerous one. And then I'd say, the Sherpa children born today, they're getting educations, and their parents often say, I'm doing this job so my kids don't have to have it. And I should add that Sherpa is a really complex term. The Sherpas who live near Everest say it's an ethnic group. The people who live further from Everest say it's a job description because people want to hire a Sherpa. And then there are the high altitude workers in Pakistan who are often called high altitude porters, which can be a disparaging term in some people's eyes from that. And so but it can also, I think in Pakistan it's just kind of what they're called. And so there's a lot of dispute over what a Sherpa is and a lot of money at stake because people want to hire a Sherpa. And so everybody says they're a Sherpa. And the people who are more closely, have a stronger claim at being ethnic Sherpas say that's not right. And the people whose lives depend on Sherpa workers say, no, it's just a job description and our lives matter too. And we shouldn't have this celebrity ethnicity.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what it typically costs to fund an expedition of this caliber and what a Sherpa could expect to get for taking those risks? And also, as a second part too, it sounded like you just kind of did your research and then got on a plane. Maybe talk a little bit about your journey. Did you have to get sponsors to do your research and kind of what that process was like?
It depends on how you want to climb. If you want to climb with a huge team of porters who bring up, who are going to bring you at a generator to run your computer and serve you really good food and such, the costs can get really high, especially I'd say at the high end of an Everest expedition will get, $150,000, $175,000 per person. It can. Some people do very bare bones expeditions, and on K2 the permit is, I'm trying to remember what it is right now, but it's a lot cheaper than Everest. It's less than $10,000. And on K2, if you're just doing a bare bones expedition and you're planning to do it all yourself, I think you could probably do it for around $10,000, maybe less if you're really good. So there's considerable range in cost. In terms of the cost of doing this project, the biggest expense is getting there. Getting to Nepal or Pakistan is, several $1,000s to get there. But if you're trekking around and living in Sherpa villages, the power of the dollar goes really far. And so you can, it's actually not that expensive to do the research once you're there. The hard part is I would do the research and then I would realize, I should have done X, Y, Z. Now I realize this. I need to go back, and getting back there is really expensive. But for the initial research, we paid for it ourselves, and then we just slept on people's couches and used frequent flyer miles, and we're living in tents, and then later the book proposal could help pay for it. The advance from the book proposal. So that's kind of how it worked financially. Oh, and the Sherpas get paid several $1,000s. It's maybe $3,000, maybe as much as, depending on how experienced they are, I would say maybe the range would be maybe $1,000 to $5,000. And there's sort of two different types of the high altitude workers who get paid a lot more than the low altitude workers who carry stuff to base camp. They don't really get paid much at all. The high altitude workers who can be really skilled, they can get paid significantly more. What's that? Oh, that's per Sherpa. That's how much each individual Sherpa will take in. Yeah. Yeah, I would say over the whole expedition. It also depends on how long the expedition is going to go for. If you happen to get lucky and everybody's acclimatized and the weather window is right when you arrive, it's probably going to be significantly cheaper because you won't have to have as much supplies being ferried in.
Oh, recently there was that altercation between the Sherpas and the Western climbers, and I was wondering if you felt that your book empowered the Sherpas, and if many of the Sherpas know about your book.
I would say we've made a big effort to let the Sherpas know about the book, and the Sherpas have really liked the book. They're really happy that their story has been told. Most Sherpas who are in climbing are not as, I don't want to say most, but a lot of them, I'll say, are illiterate. And, you know, we went through the book page by page with the major characters who are not fantastic readers. But I don't know how much the Sherpas know about the details of the book, but I hope they do. The fight on Everest, so there was literally a high altitude brawl, supposedly, up on Camp 3 on Everest recently. And I don't really know what to think about that. I mean, part of me, from the Western climbers were well-respected climbers who knew what they were doing and have done a lot for the Sherpas before. They continued up when the Sherpas had told them not to, but they were on a separate team and were competent enough probably to keep climbing on their own. On the other hand, I've not seen many detailed interviews with the Sherpas, and I haven't interviewed the Sherpas, and so I feel like half the story has not been told yet. So it's really hard to, so based on the facts that have come out, I feel like the Westerners look really good, but those facts have mostly come from the Westerners. Most of the people there are still at Everest Base Camp. It's hard to get interviews there unless you go to Nepal or people really want to spend a lot of money on a sat phone to tell the story of the Sherpas. So I think it's going to be a while till the facts shake out on that. And I don't really know where to blame, but it's a tough situation.
Hi, thanks for coming. You mentioned, the story about the naming, and then you said that the language and the culture are disappearing. So I was curious if you could tell a couple more interesting things you found in the culture and what's happening to it.
Absolutely. A few really interesting things. One, there's kind of at a lot of the villages I went to, the elders there told me, this is where the world started. This is the beginning of life. The beginning of life was at Rolwalling right here, at Bedding, and everybody who leaves is going to die. And actually, you need to move here because you seem like a good person. And you need to get all of our children to move here because they're leaving and they're going to be killed along with everybody else. And then the young people say, that story is completely made up. They just tell that to entertain Westerners. And they just miss us because everybody's leaving these villages and the festivals are going away and things just aren't what they used to be. And so I talked to anthropologists about this and said, well, what's the real story? They didn't know either. But it's really sad. The village that Chhiring grew up in used to have, several hundred people. And when I went there was just 23 people. And they were all really old. And the young people are all moving to Kathmandu, the city in Nepal, to take jobs in mountaineering. And in Pakistan, I felt like the villages were much more, the villages I went to, they had a lot more going on and they still retained a lot more of the culture. But in some ways, we're also going through that transition to more people leaving the city to the Western world. And I feel like one of the things I learned from this project is, on the one hand, it's easy to characterize. I come home and I think, gosh, I live so comfortably. I'm not going to die of a contagious disease. Life is really pretty good for me, and I really have so much. And I saw how comfortable my life is. And then on the other hand, I thought, gosh, I have so little. If I lived in a village, I would know who all my neighbors were, and I'd spend a lot more time drinking tea and playing games and really caring about my community. And so I can see how Western or globalization or whatever you want to call it is is isolating us as it makes us more comfortable, and that's certainly happening in the villages in a very dramatic way.
So in your presentation here, you talk a lot about the lessons that go beyond just this story and looking outside the life. Is that also themes that are addressed in the book itself too?
A little bit. I try not to talk too much about myself in the book because I feel like I learned all these lessons, but here are people who were dying. And here are, I felt like, oh gosh, I had some crazy adventures, like, as was mentioned here, this long story, but I overdosed on a worm with shrooms growing out of its head for karma purposes and had to be evacuated on a helicopter, and it was very scary and life-changing and strange, and we were all declared dead, and it was a crazy adventure. But I feel like that was a crazy adventure for me. But the lessons are more for the climbers had a much more life and death experience than I ever did, and are much more courageous people than I was. I wasn't climbing K2. That said, I try not to be too judgmental of them because it's hard to judge people at their worst moments when they're oxygen deprived. But that said, I tried to very clearly make sure the facts are in place so that somebody reading this can say, oh, that's how I think about this situation, and can draw those lessons from it. Because I felt like there are lessons. It's hard for me to come up with a real universal lesson, except, which I feel like is a really important universal lesson, is Sherpas are all around us. There's Sherpas in every story, and you need to know about the people you're working with because you depend on them, whether you're trying to climb up your own mountain, whether you're climbing up K2. And I feel like the fundamental lesson I learned from this was that it's sort of a teamwork lesson, which is know the members of your team, and that was something that more mountaineers could do.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. This was fun.